everybody, it's Mrs. Powell. We're going to continue reading Mr. Popper's Penguins, and we are on Chapter 3, Out of the Antarctic. With the excitement of having the great Admiral Drake speak to him over the radio, and his curiosity about the Admiral's message to him, Mr. Popper did not sleep very well that night. He did not see how he could possibly wait to find out about what the surprise was. When morning came, he was almost sorry that he had nowhere to go. No houses to paint, no rooms to paper. It would have helped him to pass the time. "Would you like the living room papered over?" he asked Mrs. Popper. "I have quite a lot of paper number 88 left over from the mayor's house." "I would not," said Mrs. Popper firmly. "The paper we have on now is plenty good enough. I am going to my meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society today, and I don't want any mess to clean up when I get home." "Very well, my love," said Mr. Popper meekly, and he settled down with his pipe, his globe, and his book of Antarctic adventures. But somehow as he read today, he could not keep his mind on the printed words. His thoughts kept going back to Admiral Drake. What could he have meant about a surprise for Mr. Popper? Fortunately for his peace of mind, he did not have to wait very long. That afternoon, while Mrs. Popper was still away at her meeting, and Janie and Bill had not yet come home from school, there was a loud ring at the front door. "I suppose it is just the mailman," thought Mr. Popper. "I won't even bother to answer it." The bell rang again, a little louder this time. Grumbling to himself, Mr. Popper went to the door. It was not the mailman who stood there. It was a delivery man with the largest box Mr. Popper had ever seen. "Does somebody by the name of Popper live here?" asked the delivery man. "That's me," he said. "Well, here's a package that comes air express all the way to Antarctica, from Antarctica. Some journey, I'll say." Mr. Popper signed the receipt and examined the box. It was covered all over with markings that said, "Unpack at once." Another one said, "Keep cool." And another one said, "Open right away." He then noticed that the box was punched here and there with air holes. Anybody know what you think's in the box? You can imagine that once he had the box inside the house, Mr. Popper lost no time in getting the screwdriver, and for this time he'd guessed that this was the surprise from Admiral Drake. He succeeded in removing the outer boards and part of the packing, which was a layer of dry ice, when he heard from deep inside the packing the faint sound, "Ork!" His heart stood still. Surely he had heard that sound before at the Drake Expedition movies. His hands were trembling so that he could barely lift off the last of the wrappings. There was not the slightest doubt about it. His surprise was a penguin. Mr. Popper was speechless with delight, but the penguin was not speechless. "Ork!" it said again, and this time it held out its flippers and jumped out over the packing debris. You can see the penguin jumping out of his box. It was a stout little fellow, about 2.5 feet tall. Although it was about the size of a small child, it looked much more like a little gentleman, wearing a tuxedo with its white waistcoat in front and its long black tailcoat dragging a little behind. Its eyes were set in 2 white circles in its black head. It turns its head from one side to the other, at first with one eye, and then with the other it examined Mr. Popper. Mr. Popper had read that penguins are extremely curious, and he soon found that this was true. For stepping out, the visitor began to inspect the house. Down the hall it went and into the bedrooms with its strange, pompous little strut. When it, or he, Mr. Popper had already begun to think of it as a he, got to the bathroom, it looked around with a pleased expression on its face. Perhaps, thought Mr. Popper, all that white tiling reminds him of the ice and snow at the South Pole. Poor thing, maybe he's thirsty. Carefully, Mr. Popper began to fill the bathtub with cold water. This was a little difficult because of the inquisitive penguin who kept reaching over and trying to bite the faucet with its sharp red beak. Finally, however, Mr. Popper succeeded in getting the tub all filled. Since the penguin kept looking over, Mr. Popper picked it up and dropped it in. The penguin did not seem to mind. "Anyway, you're not shy," said Mr. Popper. "I guess you've sort of gotten used to playing around with those explorers at the South Pole." When he thought the penguin had had enough of a bath, he drew out the stopper. He was just wondering what to do next when Janey and Bill burst in from school. And that is the end of chapter 3, friends.